Hey guys, June here, and in this video we're going to talk about the absolute basics of dealing good DPS with Melee. We'll take a look at setting a bar up that works well with Revolution, whether or not you choose to use that. We'll also talk about individual abilities and when and how to use them, and finally we'll take a zoomed out look at our ability rotation and see if we can set up some guidelines for rotating our abilities long term. Let's start by taking a look at setting up a bar, because this is one of the things that gets most players hung up as they're starting out with EOC. The two bars on screen now are examples that I use, but the only thing that's really important about the order of abilities on these bars is that the 6 basic abilities on the left, the order is important if and when you're using Revolution because it prioritizes to the left. The first ability on these two bars, Fury, is arguably the most important part of doing high, consistent melee DPS and is also probably the most misunderstood ability when it comes to melee. There are 3 important things to keep in mind when using the ability Fury. First, it's a channeled ability or a combo ability, and if you try to use this ability while you're moving, the walking actually cancels the ability, only the first hit goes through and it deals dramatically less damage than it would otherwise. Because of this, if you're using melee in a situation where you have to be constantly moving, such as Insight tanking at Rise of the Six, you should just completely eliminate Fury from your rotation and move all the other basics to the left to compensate. The second thing to keep in mind is that Fury contributes a critical hit chance bonus to the next ability depending on how many of the hits of Fury went through, and so if possible we should try to rotate our abilities such that Fury always comes before a high damaging ability like a Threshold ability. Because Fury has such a short cooldown, we can actually use it every third ability, so it's quite easy to orient a rotation long term between using some other basic ability, followed by Fury, followed by a Threshold ability. We'll talk about that pattern in more detail later on in the video when we talk about our rotation long term. The last thing to keep in mind is that Fury is designed to channel for 5 game ticks and deal a total of 3 hits, however it's actually quite weak if channeled fully like this. Not only does the ability itself actually deal less average damage when channeled fully like this, but it slows down your adrenaline gain overall, and so your objective should be to cancel it as quickly as possible, only allowing 2 of the hits to go through. When used by Revolution without interference, Revolution allows all 3 hits of Fury to go through and will stack the next ability used on top of that 3rd hit like you see in this video clip. Instead, we want to literally activate another ability as soon as possible after using Fury, and instead that will stack the hit on top of the 2nd hit. This difference in the way that Fury is used is the reason that my bars don't match the best Revolution bars on the RuneScape wiki, which are set up to assume that you're not doing any kind of manual input to cancel Fury. Although only one small change, this difference increases your average damage by about 10% overall and is certainly worth starting practicing now and getting comfortable doing consistently. The next ability on our bar is actually different for two-handed and dual-wield, however in practice they are effectively the same. They deal the same high damage and have the same short cooldown, however Cleave, the two-handed variant, has the added effect of hitting multiple enemies, which is a common theme we'll see with many other two-handed abilities as well. Likewise, Decimate, the dual-wield variant, has the added effect of dealing higher damage against enemies who are wearing a shield, however it's only coded to work against players and doesn't deal increased damage against NPCs who are using a shield such as Commander Ziliana. Apart from the fact that the two-handed option here deals much better damage to groups of enemies, as we'll see consistently as we continue to look at other abilities, there's nothing special to think about with these two in particular. Next up we have Dismember, which is another very interesting ability with quite a few different caveats that we need to keep in mind when using it. The first is its damage over time ability, meaning it takes several seconds for all of the damage from the effect to go through, and so if you're fighting mobs with relatively low HP that you kill in just a few hits, it's usually not worthwhile using Dismember because the enemy is likely to die before you get the full damage returns from using the ability in the first place. The second important consideration is actually something we need to keep in mind with all damage over time abilities, and that's that only one effect can be active for each individual ability at one time. If, for example, you and a friend are duoing the King Black Dragon and you both use Dismember at the same time, one of your Dismember effects gets completely cancelled by the other, and so the probability that this ability is going to get all of its damage out decreases as the number of people on your team using melee increases, as it's more likely that someone else is going to use Dismember and cancel your Dismember before all the damage goes through. Luckily for now, there aren't many really large team bosses that suit several people using melee simultaneously, however if for any reason you find yourself in that situation, simply get rid of Dismember from your rotation, move all the other basic abilities to the left to compensate, and if necessary you can put another high damage basic like Barge on the end to make sure you have enough to keep rotating. The third consideration with this ability is that for those of you with 99 strength, the Strength Skill Cape perk increases the damage from this ability quite significantly, and so it's definitely worthwhile wearing while using melee, and for those of you with max or comp capes, definitely a perk you want to include in those. In that same vein, if you're really looking to take your DPS to the next level, there's also the Lunging perk through Invention, which although not strong enough to justify getting rid of one of your other weapon perks, can be put on a switch weapon specifically to use just for Dismember. If, for example, you're using Dry Gores and you have Aftershock on your main hand and Precise on your offhand, it might be common for really high-level PVMers to have a second offhand with the Lunging 3 perk just to swap to for using for Dismember, then to swap back to your primary weapons. This adds quite a bit of effort to PVM, and the overall damage increase is relatively small. However, any increase can be beneficial, and if you're willing to put in the effort, that option is available to you. Finally, our last consideration with Dismember is another thing that's shared by most damage over time abilities, and that's that they're not affected by many types of damage boosts. In particular, our damage boosting ultimate Berserk, which we'll talk about shortly, which increases the damage of most abilities by 100%, does not affect Dismember, so while under the effect of Berserk, we're going to leave Dismember out of our rotation completely. This is, however, quite easy to do, and we'll see a great example of this later on when we take a look at a long-term rotation. Our fourth ability, Sever, is another really simple ability we don't really need to consider anything special about. It deals great damage, and it also reduces the damage that your enemy deals against you for a short time, and overall just doesn't require any kind of special attention. Altogether, these first 4 abilities represent our high damage basic abilities. The remaining 2 are significantly weaker and only exist here in order to fill out our rotations as necessary. Our objective at all times is going to be to maximize our use of these first 4 and minimize our use of the remaining 2, and luckily by orienting our abilities this way and prioritizing to the left, we'll do this quite easily automatically. Those remaining 2 weaker abilities don't require much in the way of special attention. The only thing to keep in mind here is that our 5th ability, Slice, does deal increased damage against a target if they're stunned or bound. This will generally be inconsequential, since not only are most bosses immune to stuns and binds, but Melee doesn't have the ability to consistently apply long-term binds itself, and so you have to piggyback on the fact that there would be another person in your team using either ranged or magic applying binds to a target for you. Regardless, if you do find yourself in that situation, you should feel compelled to use Slice significantly more often, since the increased damage does put it on par with the stronger basics we were talking about before. Now, obviously this isn't an exhaustive list of all the basic abilities for Melee, however the ones we haven't discussed are significantly weaker and should never be used as part of a normal rotation. As I mentioned earlier, the only other basic ability we might consider using is Barge, which although it does have its movement utility, also deals the same average damage as the 2 weaker basics that we have on our bar here. The only circumstance you'd ever actually need to incorporate that are any that prevent you from using the abilities Fury or Dismember effectively. So now that we've got a solid grasp on how our basic abilities work, let's move on and talk about our thresholds. First up on the two-handed bar, we have a two-hander specific ability called Hurricane, which not only deals spectacular damage against your primary target, but it hits all enemies within a 3x3 area around the player. This is another one of the abilities that sets two-handed Melee apart from dual wield in its ability to deal high damage to groups of enemies, but otherwise doesn't require much in the way of special considerations. The ability that fits into this slot for dual wield, Destroy, is another wonderful high damaging ability, but it does have a few things for us to keep in mind. Firstly, it's a channeled ability, which again means that we can't use this ability while moving. Each of the 4 hits of Destroy stuns and binds your target, which mostly is going to be beneficial, however do not try to use this ability on the northern pool at Yakamaru. Finally, the last consideration is that Destroy is one of many channeled abilities that causes Revolution to derp out a little bit at the end of the channeling process, which causes a stall before activating the next ability. To see what I mean, let's look at a side-by-side comparison. On the left, I'm manually activating the ability that I'm going to use after Destroy as soon as the 4th hit of Destroy has gone through, and on the right side, I'm allowing Revolution to activate that ability. As you can see, there's a pretty significant delay between when that second ability is activated between the 2 video clips, and part of doing good DPS when using Revolution is knowing to activate an ability following these types of channeled abilities. The timing for activating that next ability synchronizes very well for when the channeling icon for Destroy falls off of your debuff bar, however it does take a bit of practice, so if you're someone who intends to continue using Revolution to DPS, head to Dummies and try it a few times for yourself. Our next threshold is the same for both styles. It's Assault, which is another one of our channeled abilities, so it does prohibit us from moving, but it does absolutely phenomenal damage, and luckily for us, it's one of very few channeled abilities that doesn't cause Revolution to derp out at the end, so we don't have to worry about manually activating the ability after it. Our next threshold is again the same for both styles, and it's a wonderfully powerful ability, however it has a slew of things that we need to keep in mind when using it. Firstly, to even use this ability, we need to unlock it from the Dig Site quest. It's also a damage over time ability, which means that it's not worth using on low HP mobs, it doesn't stack well with other players, and it's not affected by most boosts, so everything that we talked about earlier in regard to Dismember holds true for Blood Tendrils as well. Finally, the last thing to consider is that Blood Tendrils, like the other Tendril abilities, does recoil some damage to the player, and though that amount is relatively low and can be combated almost entirely from using Soul Split, players who don't have access to Soul Split may need to be a bit more strategic about when and how they use Blood Tendrils as part of their rotation. The next pair of abilities are what really distinguish two-handed melee as being fundamentally quite a bit better than dual-wield melee in most circumstances. The two-handed ability Quake is a simple strong hit against your primary target as well as some AoE damage to any enemies standing around the player, which again distinguishes two-handed melee as being quite a bit better at dealing damage to groups of enemies than dual-wield melee. The real beauty of this ability, however, is in its debuff to the enemy's affinity, and without going into too much detail about what affinity is and how it works, this applies directly to the enemy and makes all the incoming attacks on that enemy more accurate. This not only increases your hit chance and thus your average damage, but it works for anyone who's attacking that same enemy while that debuff is active. This effect is obviously only useful if the target has high enough defense that you can't get 100% hit chance against them. However, most high-level bosses meet that criteria, and in those circumstances this increases your and your team's DPS quite significantly. The ability that fits into this space for dual wield is unfortunately quite underwhelming. It's a channeled ability, which means it prohibits movement, and it causes Revolution to do that derpy thing at the end, so if we're using it we do need to pay attention to activating the ability following it. It is the one dual-wield ability which hits an area of effect around the player, however it does quite weak damage and unfortunately isn't worth using unless you're hitting 4 or 5 different targets with it. The only circumstances you'd ever really want to use this ability in capitalize a lot on that AoE damage, and like we've seen throughout this video, two-hander definitely has the advantage in that circumstance, so this ability is only ever going to be used as a switch from two-handed to dual-wield just for this one ability and then back to two-handed in situations where you're trying to maximize your area of effect damage. Finally, our last threshold is again the same for both styles. This is the ability Slaughter, and it's a damage over time ability and has all of the caveats as we've talked about previously. It's not worth using on low HP mobs, it doesn't stack well with other players, and it doesn't benefit from most boosts. However, it has something unique in that if the enemy moves after you've used this ability on them, it deals 3 times as much damage. This is often quite easy to do. For any melee using enemy, all you need to do is step away from them, and for ranged and magic using enemies, all you need to do is step under them to cause them to move off of that spot. If for some reason, however, it's impossible for you to move the enemy, such as situations like Yakimaru where he's confined to pools as part of the mechanics of his fight, it's actually not worth using Slaughter because the base damage without that tripling effect is quite low. That concludes the thresholds that you'd ever use as part of normal DPS rotations. However, again, this isn't an exhaustive list and there are a few other melee thresholds, in particular the stunning thresholds. Again, the reason these haven't been discussed is they deal quite a bit less damage than the thresholds that we've talked about and never should come up as part of a normal rotation unless you absolutely need to stun your enemy for some reason. This brings us to our ultimates, and there's really only ever one good choice with melee. That's our damage boosting ultimate ability Berserk, which increases the damage we deal and the damage we take for 20 seconds, although this excludes the damage over time abilities that we talked about. This is absolutely the centerpiece of a good melee DPS rotation, and your ultimate goal at all times is pretty much to Berserk as often and as quickly as possible. Although the extra damage taken can often cost you in supplies, there are simply no circumstances where it's worth giving up the incredible DPS contribution from Berserk in order to save on supplies. The only other important thing to consider about Berserk is that it's not directly an attack itself, and being a non-damaging ability, it can allow us to get an auto-attack in, and we'll talk about how to do that shortly. The only other melee ultimate you might find cause to use is a two-handed specific ability called Meteor Strike, which is a very powerful area of effect hit. This ability is only worthwhile using in situations where you benefit from the area of effect damage, but it also gives you a passive boost to your adrenaline gain from critical hits, and so it can help you build back up your adrenaline after surrendering that 100% for using an ultimate ability. In those situations where you're trying to maximize your area of effect damage, you essentially just alternate back and forth between using Berserk and Meteor Strike. So now that we understand how our abilities work, let's make a plan for a long-term rotation, and we'll start by separating our thresholds into 2 categories. There's a set of thresholds we want to use before and between using Berserk, and there's a set of thresholds we want to use while Berserk is active. In the before and between category, we have Blood Tendrils, Slaughter, and Quake, and the reasoning on the first 2 should be quite self-explanatory. They don't receive the boosted damage from Berserk, so it would be wasteful to use them during Berserk. The reason we have Quake in this category is because anytime you're in a situation where you benefit from the accuracy bonus from using Quake, it's definitely your highest priority threshold, and so you'll want to get at least one use of it in before we start doing Berserk rotations. In the during Berserk category, we simply have our highest damaging threshold abilities that benefit from that Berserk boost, and so our objective is going to be to get both Assault and Hurricane or Assault and Destroy off during our Berserk every time, depending on whether we're using two-handed or dual-wield. The reason we also have Quake in this category is because when you're using two-handed, if you have an Adrenaline Potion available when you're doing your ultimate, you can fit Quake in at the very end after using both Assault and Hurricane, and you certainly should do so as it does benefit from the Berserk boost. With that said, there's only one last thing to consider before we finally put it all together into a full rotation, and that's how we can use auto attacks in our ability rotation. Lucky for us with Melee, it's quite simple, and the first option is simply when engaging combat, we can auto attack the enemy on the first tick before we even start using abilities. This is great for a small amount of adrenaline gain as well as getting some damage in right off the bat. However, it's most important for preventing a targeting glitch that can occasionally cause you to not gain adrenaline from using your first ability. This is important not only for Melee but for all attack styles, and is definitely a habit you should start forming now. The second opportunity also appears for all attack styles, and that's anytime we use a non-attacking ability, and there are tons of examples of this, like Freedom, Berserk, Anticipation, Devotion, Reprisal, or pretty much any ability that's not directly targeted against the enemy. You can see in this video clip that as I continue to use non-damaging abilities, small auto-attack hits continue to go through, and it's important to utilize these anytime we feel forced to use one of these abilities. The important thing to keep in mind with auto attacks is that if you're using a two-hander, it requires a fourth tick to get an auto attack to go through, and so you should stall using your next ability after a non-damaging ability to make sure that you can get that full auto attack in. This will be most important when we're using our damage boosting ultimate Berserk, where we'll want to stall that one tick before we use the Berserk ability to make sure that the very first thing that goes through during the normal global cooldown of Berserk is our auto attack. This is not only important for building adrenaline in our Berserk, but that auto attack also gets the boosted damage from Berserk and we get some phenomenal damage in right away. Doing this is mostly simple and intuitive, but there is one issue that often catches players off guard, and that is if the ability that you used right before the non-damaging ability that you expected to get an auto attack in was a channeled ability, you will not have an auto attack on that non-damaging ability. In the case of Melee, the biggest culprit here would be the ability Fury, so we just want to pay special attention to the fact that we're not using Fury as our last ability right before we use Berserk. So now let's take everything that we've learned thus far and put it all together into a rotation. The very first thing we do when we engage combat is going to be to slip in that first auto attack, and after that we're going to start building adrenaline by rotating our basics simply by prioritizing to the left. If we're using Fury properly and cancelling it on that second hit, we should notice a nice pattern developing where we're using it every third ability. We'll continue using this pattern until all four of our high damage basics are on cooldown simultaneously. This will be when we start using our before and between Berserk thresholds. In this situation, we'll assume that accuracy is going to matter, so we want to start with Quake and then go back to building Adrenaline. The second threshold that we'll use is Blood Tendrils, and then we'll follow that with a little bit more of Adrenaline building, and then finally Slaughter, going on the assumption that we're dealing with an enemy that we can move even though this is an immobile combat dummy. That's the last of our before Berserk thresholds, so now our objective is to build our Adrenaline all the way to 100% and use Berserk. We'll do the normal things like Ring of Vigor switch for our ultimate, and as we discussed in the segment on auto attacks, we're going to stall one extra tick before using Berserk to make sure that we get that auto attack in. We'll also use an Adrenaline potion, so it only takes us 2 basic abilities to get back to being able to use thresholds. However, instead of using Fury, which is the leftmost ability that's available right now, I'm going to start with Cleave instead. Fury will continue to be used once every 3 abilities, however by doing this it inverts the pattern, so Fury is going to be coming before our high damage thresholds, and that extra critical hit chance bonus on the ability Fury is going to apply to a higher damage attack this way. From here, we'll simply continue this pattern to make sure that we're using all of the thresholds to use within Berserk as we discussed earlier. In this case, that'll mean getting Assault in first, followed by Hurricane, and because I had an Adrenaline potion available, I'll also be able to fit Quake in at the very end. Once that Quake hits, our Berserk effect has officially worn off, and our objective switches back to building Adrenaline and moving on to using our between and before Berserk thresholds over again. Only Slaughter and Blood Tendrils are going to be available again this time because we slipped Quake in at the very end of our Berserk rotation, so it's going to remain on cooldown for most of our rebuild. Once we've used our between Berserk thresholds again, we can continue building, and we'll actually find that we reach 100% Adrenaline before Berserk comes back off cooldown. This presents us with a few choices. If the enemy has high defense, it's best to use Onslaught, which you see me using in this video clip, and that's also especially good for this rotation because everything will be off cooldown and available for rebuilding once Onslaught expires, and we can essentially repeat this. We could also take some of the thresholds that we normally use only within Berserk and rotate them while we wait for Berserk to come back off cooldown. We could even do a shield switch for revenge rotations, assuming we're in an appropriate situation. Thank you guys as always for watching. Hopefully this video had everything that you need to kick your Melee DPS into high gear. Magic and ranged versions of this video will be coming very soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that, and as always, big thanks to God's Paladin for his support on Patreon. Link is on screen if you're feeling generous and want to support my videos through Patreon as well, but until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video.